For decades, we've grown used to the image of medieval peasant huts being portrayed as makeshift shelters, just a few walls of mud mixed with straw, thrown together in a hurry to withstand a harsh life, and because of that, most people today simply assume those structures could only last a few decades before rotting away or collapsing. Yet the moment you compare that obvious truth with recent archaeological surveys, especially the data showing more than 3,000 peasant houses whose structural frames remain intact to this day, you're forced to admit there's a massive misunderstanding hiding in plain sight, one that has long obscured the technical abilities of communities. History often labels as poor, primitive, or uneducated. The fact that these houses not only survived 7 centuries of climate shifts, wars, and social upheaval, but even outlasted many stone buildings belonging to nobles of the same era, reveals that what we casually call huts are actually the product of an incredibly sophisticated building tradition, one shaped by generations of experimentation rather than accidental luck. And perhaps, right at that starting point, the moment you realize every assumption about fragility begins to crumble, you might want to revisit the entire story from a different angle. If these findings spark your curiosity or challenge what you once believed to be true about medieval life, feel free to share your thoughts, because your perspective might just open up another layer of meaning in the journey to decode these seemingly humble homes. When you compare the quiet survival of more than 3,000 medieval peasant houses with the makeshift hut image passed down by textbooks and illustrations, you're forced to confront a paradox that's hard to explain. How could people with no blueprints, no technical schooling, and not even a single surviving construction manual create ordinary dwellings whose durability not only endured 7 centuries of brutal climate, but in many cases outlasted the stone residences of the ruling class? It's this contradiction that archaeologists call the central problem in the study of medieval vernacular architecture, because behind those seemingly primitive layers of mud, timber, and thatch lies a technical thought system sharpened through hundreds of years of observation, experimentation, and trial and error, refined enough to adapt to the most extreme environmental shifts of the era. The deeper researchers dig into carbonized beams, wattle and daub walls, or stone footings etched by time, the clearer it becomes that the question, why did they last so long, is no longer a side note, but the key that unlocks an entire school of engineering that had been forgotten. And if that improbable endurance makes you feel like the story is widening beyond every familiar frame, write down your thoughts, because that very sense of questioning is the first step toward understanding why these small houses became a mystery that has lasted for centuries. To understand why medieval peasant houses were designed as complete survival machines, we have to return to one of the most brutal backdrops of post-medieval Europe, when around the year 1300, the climate suddenly shifted and pushed the entire continent into a cold cycle that lasted more than 4 centuries, a catastrophe we now call the Little Ice Age. But for the people living through it, it wasn't a natural event at all. It was a sentence. Winter stretched up to 8 months, summer turned wet and sunless, farmland became so waterlogged that wheat couldn't germinate, and major rivers like the Thames froze thick enough for people to build markets on the ice without fear of it breaking. The greatest shock appears in the records of 1,315, 1,317, when rain fell non-stop for more than a year, wiping out crops, killing livestock on a massive scale, sending wheat prices soaring more than 6-fold, and forcing millions to eat bread mixed with tree bark, forest roots, and even human flesh in desperation. Historians estimate that up to 12% of Europe's population vanished in just the first few years of the cold. And what's even more terrifying is that all of this horror was only the opening chapter of the 4 centuries that followed. The twist lies here. While stone castles lost heat, grew moldy, and cracked apart from freeze-thaw cycles, the very earth and timber houses people dismissed as inferior became thermal fortresses that kept entire communities alive, proving that in a moment when death stood right outside the door, the engineering of peasants was no less capable than any architectural school. If this detail surprises you or makes you rethink your familiar assumptions about the Middle Ages, feel free to share your thoughts, because sometimes a viewer's first reaction opens up some unexpectedly interesting angles in a story like this. When we look at the materials, medieval peasants used clay, straw, willow branches, animal dung, shed hair, even animal blood. Modern people usually react instinctively, crude, filthy, poor. But if you place those materials in their real context, in the endless cold of the Little Ice Age, where a single deep freeze night could wipe out an entire family because of one small crack in the wall, you begin to see that the things we assume were the bottom of poverty were actually the final line of defense against death, chosen not through aesthetics but through survival experience built over hundreds of years. The disturbing part isn't that they mixed dung with earth to build walls, but that this mixture, with its undigested cellulose fibers, with its dense ammonia hanging in the air, created a natural insulating membrane capable of keeping warmth inside the house like a slow-breathing lung. Even human hair and blood mixed into the mud weren't signs of desperation, but deliberate choices because their fibrous and protein structures helped the walls withstand tension and resist cracking when eastern winds slammed directly into them on nights so cold the doors froze to their frames. And this is the hidden truth few people want to admit. The things we call dirty were, in fact, the most sophisticated survival technology peasants possessed, a technique refined not on drafting tables but in winters, where every tiny crack in the wall could mean only one thing: the cold had found its way in. For medieval peasants, the first enemy of a house wasn't wind, storms, or snow. It was the cold, damp ground itself. The thing that could drain heat, rot timber, and make an entire frame collapse after just a few winters. That's why they never drove posts directly into the soil the way we imagine, but instead raised the entire structure on carefully selected flat stones, creating a survival cushion that both separated the wood from moisture and blocked the underground cold from bleeding straight into the floor. Archaeology shows that many houses bear traces of 3 or 4 rounds of stone replacement, proving this method wasn't a momentary invention, but a tradition refined across generations. The surprising part is that this seemingly minor detail created a life or death difference. By placing wood on stone, the end grain, which normally absorbs water like a sponge, was protected. The frame endured for centuries, and more importantly, the thin layer of air between stone and timber acted as a thermal buffer, keeping indoor temperatures 3 to 5 degrees warmer than outside, a gap wide enough to turn a deep freeze night into something a human body could still survive. And the twist lies here. While proud stone castles were being eroded by the cold ground beneath them, the small houses of peasants endured because they understood that sometimes raising a home just a few centimeters above the earth was enough to hold death at bay for hundreds of years. Across the entire structure of a medieval peasant house, no component raises more questions or carries a deeper sense of mystery than the cruck frame, a form of architecture that at first glance seems simple. Yet the more researchers study it, the more it feels like a semi-mythical knowledge distilled over generations, almost completely undocumented yet appearing with remarkable consistency across agricultural regions of Europe. The first astonishing detail is the way they search for naturally curved trees in the forest, split them with such precision that the two halves were nearly identical, then raised them into paired bent blades that formed an A-frame arch, strong enough that even the blizzards of the Little Ice Age couldn't snap it. Dendrochronology shows that more than 3,000 such structures still survive, and what confounds modern engineers is how peasants with no steel rulers, no load-bearing models, understood how to distribute weight so that the force from the roof traveled along the wood's natural curve, giving the frame both stability and an uncanny flexibility. Under strong winds, the entire structure bends slightly as if breathing, then returns to its exact shape, a kind of movement many architects today describe as biological behavior rather than pure engineering. Even more remarkable is that this system required only about 1/3 the timber used in noble houses, meaning that in a time of scarce resources and tightly controlled forests, peasants had unintentionally created a method that conserved wood while still lasting for centuries. And perhaps it's the sense that they were operating within a nameless, half-intuitive, half-experimental body of knowledge that makes these cruck frames feel so enigmatic. If this quiet sophistication makes you curious or forces you to question what we assume to be modern engineering, feel free to share your thoughts, because sometimes a viewer's perspective reveals layers of meaning archaeology alone can't fully explain. Inside the wattle and daub walls we usually imagine as nothing. More than simple mud mixed with straw, there is actually a survival mechanism so eerie and so intricate that many researchers have admitted they completely underestimated medieval folk engineering. Because when each layer of material is examined, It turns out that what kept an entire family warm through a 15 degrees Celsius night wasn't just earth or straw fibers, but the layer of dung silently fermenting inside the wall, generating a microheat output strong enough to prevent interior surfaces from freezing, while releasing a faint warmth that archaeological reports describe as walls exhaling on deep winter nights. Even more striking is that the ammonia in the dung, something we now consider a bad smell, acted as a natural antibacterial agent, preventing wood rot, repelling insects, and for people of the time, the rising ammoniac vapor in winter was even believed to ward off evil, a form of protection that was both physical and spiritual. When mixed with shed hair, animal blood, or undigested cellulose fibers, the daub became a kind of living mortar, with enough tension and elasticity that it didn't crack under eastern winter winds and didn't let the cold penetrate the way stone or brick would. The twist lies here. The very things modern people call dirty were their most sophisticated technology, a technology perfected not by engineers, but by families, forced to survive winters capable of wiping out an entire village in just a few nights. To modernize, a thatched roof is nothing more than a cheap, lightweight, flammable material. But in winters where snow could collapse an entire livestock shelter in a single night, that structure operated as a survival shield matched by almost no other material, because when snowfall grew so heavy that it compressed air into layered ice, a thatch roof, nearly 2 handspans thick, would bend slightly under the load and then distribute the force along its slopes, creating an elastic movement many modern architects describe as calculated softness. What shocks researchers is that in many archaeological cases, thatched roofs withstood snow loads that would fold modern tile or metal roofs, simply because millions of hollow tubes within the straw trapped pockets of air that formed a natural layer of insulation, preventing the snow from melting and refreezing into stone-like weight. And on stormy nights when winds carried embers from the hearth, flames sometimes licked across the roof surface without spreading, because the tightly layered, angled thatch allowed fire to slide over it without catching the dry core underneath, a paradox that modern people struggle to believe, but one that was a life-or-death lesson for the thatchers of the time. On 30 degrees Celsius nights during the Little Ice Age, when entire valleys sank into a thick, suffocating silence, and even the moon seemed frozen in midair, the heating system of a medieval peasant house stopped being an architectural detail and became the thin boundary between life and death. If the door stayed open for more than 3 seconds, a blade-sharp wave of cold would rush in, sweeping across the floor like an invisible creature capable of extinguishing the warmth the family had guarded for hours. Inside, an open hearth released smoke as dense as morning fog, a warm but dangerous haze that forced children to sleep close to the ground, where the air was still breathable, while the upper layer remained filled with smoke that adults saw as a protective membrane against insects, mold, and even evil spirits, according to folk belief. Livestock cows, goats, sheep were kept just behind a thin wooden partition, their breath rising in white coils like tiny clouds, and the 1,500 British thermal units of heat each animal produced turned the entire house into a living thermal incubator, a collective heating system no modern stove can replicate when fuel is scarce. The twist lies here. If you remove the animals from under the same roof, the longhouse temperature would drop instantly by 6-8 degrees Celsius, enough to turn a cold night into a death sentence for the entire family, meaning that cohabitation wasn't a rural tradition, it was a razor-sharp survival strategy.